Ladies and metalfish, this is your hard-boiled and handsome duelist daddy, Janjo Joestar, the dote, the duelist of all time. So, a while ago, I made a video about the odd confusion on Ultimate Offering in the OCG. I should mention a slip-up I said because it's tangential. I like that word. It wasn't that people thought it gave you a free special summon, rather it was that Yugioh would give you an additional normal summon that bypassed tribute costs. This is because the translation says, quote, "You can summon separately from normal summons," unquote. I mentioned this in a passerby statement in another video, but I figured I'd say it again because at the end of the day, Ultimate Offering was a weirdly worded card no matter which region it was released in. This is tangential, I just love saying that word, because another odd card released in Series 1 OCG was Yugioh. Also in the past, I made a video discussing the use of fusions in Series 1. They were mostly rogue decks like Black Skull Turbo or tech cards like Twin-Headed Forbidden Memories Dragon and Musician King, but they did have their place in the history of deck building. In that discussion, I briefly mentioned Yugioh. Looking at that card, which took a while for its TCG release, you may wonder what the point is. Its effect is, you can pay 3000 LP, send one monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. The original erratum in the OCG was more or less the same, just specifying the fusion deck since that is what it was called during the Stone Age, or during my time, the Ice Age. On the lookout, you may wonder what the point is. If you're unaware, typically if a monster that requires a special summoning condition, like say Giltia the D Knight or Horus the Black Flame Dragon level 8, if they're sent to the graveyard before their summoning conditions were met, then they must still be summoned via their condition. This means you cannot revive them otherwise. So you can't discard Blackluster Soldier Envoy of the Beginning off Graceful Charity and use Premature Burial for a surprise combo. This is a rule made to ensure that the game isn't filled with more degenerate combos and abuse of idealistically strong boss monsters. After all, a card like Yugioh Richie is designed the way it is, and if you were to circumvent that, then that defeats the entire purpose of the card. Though I suppose if we're talking about Yugioh Richie Rich over here, then that may not be the worst workaround. This leads us to December 1st, 1999, and the release of Booster 6 that included Yugioh. Like I mentioned, its effect is to dump a fusion monster to the grave, but its purpose is questionable given you can't summon anything off of it. At best, perhaps later down the line, you can send a light or dark fusion for a chaos play, or maybe to boost your Bazoo, the Soul Eater. This was the same set that introduced Cyberstein, in which you could pay 2000 more life points for an on-field fusion that can get you way more advantage at face value. So was Yugioh printed to be a mirage, created to be a similar card to Stein yet unusable, befitting a filler card? And if you're enjoying this video, then go ahead and drop a like because YouTube likes any sort of engagement. That'll help the channel out in the long run. Plus, check out my Patreon if you want to directly support the channel further while getting sweet perks like early access and exclusive content. What if that previous statement about Yugioh was a lie? What if you were allowed to revive fusion monsters sent from Dagra, at least back in 1999? Well, aside from 2 Tokyo Dome prize cards, the strongest fusion you can get your hands on would be Black Skull Dragon from Volume 5, right before the release of Booster 6. So, okay, would it be possible then to run a deck that used Yugioh to tangentially summon Black Skull Dragon? There's that word again. Well, here's the thing. Technically speaking, back in Series 1, there were no restrictions prohibiting you to special summon conditional monsters from the graveyard. 1999 Yu-Gi-Oh! Was full of weird effect and game rulings, so it's not too much of a surprise all things considered. Hell, I've made an entire video about OCG erratas. It makes sense when you think about it. Much like Victory Dragon and the lack of any surrender rules in the OCG, which I elaborated further in my OCG Series 3 video, Dagra was made the way it was because there was a lack of condition limitations. It was purposefully designed so that you can use its effect to revive the sent monster. Why would Konami spend any effort on an effect monster during this era that would otherwise be unplayable? They wouldn't. Should you want to run a fusion deck during this era, then it would be completely okay to tech in Dagra if you decided there was merit to it over Stein, or possibly that was the only fusion adjacent monster you had. It is unfortunate that you can't use both Stein and Dagra in the same duel unless you find a way to increase your life points, since both effects would equal to 8,000. In that regard, you're better off running Stein. Smoke him if you got him, I suppose. This creates a whole other issue. With no revival rule, the potential extends from just the fusion deck. Like I mentioned earlier with Horus and BLS, there were monsters in Series 1 that could be summoned from the grave despite them normally requiring a condition to be met. It's not like some monster effects reflected this, such as Gate Guardian reading as, quote, can be summoned by offering Sangha of the Thunder, Kazejin, and Suijin as tribute, unquote. However, the clause was still intended when looking at Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth or Great Moth that does mention the one way to summon it, which by the way, Great Moth was surprisingly released after its perfect form. Quote, it cannot be summoned unless Petite Moth is sacrificed 6 turns after Cocoon of Evolution is attached, unquote. But with no aftermarket restrictions, this bypass was an oversight by Konami. Another thing is, even if you read Moth's effect and think, hey, that sounds like you don't need to summon it correctly first, keep in mind that back in 1999, this was the Wild West of duel monsters. Konami didn't have many major tourneys, so most of the rulings, or lack thereof, were casual or local levels that probably said, screw it, I can summon since nothing was mentioned in the rulebook to say otherwise. This could be applied to rituals as well, theoretically. I say that because no one played rituals at the time, as for 1, they were suboptimal in meta play, and 2, they were seen more as collector's cards. So it could have happened just on the basis of the lack of a revival rule during this time. It wouldn't be until the end of Series 1 on December 16th with the EX starter box and the inclusion of the 3rd edition rulebook that we would get any sort of rules regarding the revival rule. This book not only mentioned the ruling for Ultimate Offering, it mentions how to ritual summon, how to fusion summon, and that monsters that require a special procedure must be summoned correctly first and can't be revived before that condition is met. At the end of everything, duelists now finally have something to point towards to in order to make sense of some of the more complex cards and mechanics at the time. And because of such, this meant that if your opponent used Mirror Force on your Cyberstein summoned monster, you could not revive it. This killed Gale Dagra's time in the OCG. It wasn't due to Dagra being a degenerate card or anything like that. Rather, it was a bystander of an unintended loophole getting patched up. But I do have to mention that even with the new rulebook, it still took time, at least a few months, for duels to have widespread knowledge of the change, like with what happened with the rule change for Sangan and Witch of the Black Forest, a topic I've covered already. For a time, yeah, have at it with Ultimate Offering summoning a Blue Eyes White Dragon for free, or reviving a discarded Gate Guardian, or using Gale Dagra to set up a Black Skull Dragon play. At least we don't have many records of these strategies being played in any high-level capacity. Ultimately, this is all just hearsay over literal evidence. Quite frankly, we don't have much to go off of during this era as is. You didn't really start to see more relevant online sources until 2000, so many legitimate reasons disappeared with the sands of time and language barriers, and the rest is left for people like History of Yugioh 1 and myself to uncover these ancient OCG tombs and spread their history. And that's where this current excavation ends. The rise and fall of Gale Dagra and, funnily enough, Gate Guardian and Perfectly Ultimate Great Moth. If anything, this was the time to play Forbidden Memories. Yes, my friends, it actually happened.